folks in every corner of Virginia about the invaluable support they receive from federal workers just like you. Across the country, Americans are counting on you to deliver crucial services, from inspecting our food to make sure it's safe, to protecting our national security, from administering Social Security benefits to staffing air traffic control towers, to supporting our allies around the world and keeping the influence of China, Iran, and Russia at bay. I know it has been and will continue to be tough. Donald Trump and cronies are determined to do anything they can to knock you off course. They've even dangled a phony buyout in your face. But make no mistake, that buyout is a trap. Donald Trump has no authority to offer you a resignation buyout. Don't trust a guy with a long history of stiffing contractors by taking him up on a sham deal that he won't follow through on. You aren't alone. I'm going to be here with you every day working alongside you in service. I want to share with you some specific ways in which I want to be a resource to you. On my website, kane.senate.gov, I am collecting stories from federal workers about what you are experiencing. Under no circumstances will I publicly share any information you send me without your consent. You can also choose to submit your information anonymously if you prefer. I will be updating my webpage with information that may be helpful to you, including summaries of your rights, recourse you can seek if you believe you are being illegally terminated, and answers to other frequently asked questions my office is receiving. Please know that I'm doing everything I can to stand up for you, just like you're standing up for and serving American people. Thanks for all that you do. And with that, Madam President, I yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Also-Brooks.
The senator from Washington.
Madam President, are we in a quorum call?
We are.
I ask that the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Madam President, I come to the floor to talk about export strategies, collaboration, and American principles. Madam President, no one likes to be left behind. I know somewhere people think there is this I win, you lose mentality. But what happened to let's grow the pie instead of just hoarding a few pieces that are left? Growth, not contraction, is the right solution. The world is more connected, not necessarily because of just because of globalization. We are now more connected because of technology, and nothing we are doing is going to stop that. The speed of information is empowering anyone with an internet connection, aided by the brain of an AI app, to get answers and ideas hundreds of times faster than ever before. Do we need new principles for the information age? Rules the world and we should strive to adhere to? I definitely agree. But Madam President, I thought we were for capitalism. Yes, capitalism in the information age needs better rules so markets aren't distorted, because markets need to be properly policed and they aren't right now. And I believe that the U.S. should aggressively define the rules in the information age. I believe in a technology NATO, a model of key democracies and key sophisticated technology countries defining the rules of the information age and telling anybody who wants to follow that, we'll give you a discount on our technology, instead of those who are advocating to buy from people who have a government backdoor, or even in today's analogy, where you allow somebody to have a government backdoor to your technology. Madam President, capitalism is still the largest, smartest export America wants to export. We want open markets, and we want more people to sell to. 95% of consumers live outside the United States. Now, it's clear not all the world community is down with capitalism, especially places like China or North Korea. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't continue to advocate for it. What has U.S. advocacy for capitalism done to grow and stabilize the world? I would say immeasurable. Immeasurable, immeasurable, immeasurable. In fact, the period from the end of World War II to the early 1970s is considered one of the greatest eras of economic expansion in world history. In the U.S., gross domestic product increased from $228 billion to just under $1.7 trillion in 1975. So whether it was Germany, Japan, South Korea, we have brought about a world economy because the shiny American dream was worth chasing. So whether it was setting market rules, growing exports, investing in innovation, this is the poster child of what the United States of America has been about. It has not been a story about contraction. It has been a story about growth. The impacts of the U.S. economy can't be ignored, but to outcompete our adversaries, we need coalitions, not go-it-alone strategies. Why do we fear this if we think our principles are correct? But somehow, the current administration thinks that we've been hurt more than we've been helped in this global equation, and they want us to believe that somehow there is a win-win situation on tariffs that they can deliver on. The American people are demanding leadership here in Washington. They want us to work together. They want us to have the best interests of the country at hand. My guess is they think that on a global basis too. I know my farmers do. Farmers, always the big potential loser in a trade war, want us to work out better economic opportunities for their future. But there are those in this administration who think we can close our borders, chill trade with tariffs, and somehow make time stand still. Well, I got news for people. The information age has blown a hole in that theory, even if there was justification for the time stand still theory before the information age. You just cannot drop anchor in the middle of this storm. You need to get to a stable harbor and create an opportunity for the future. And trade, Madam President, not only grows economic opportunity, it helps change culture. And there are some cultures that are worth affecting. It's better to have a job than be attracted to join a terrorist organization. It's better to create economic stability than fueling poverty and migration. And tariffs are a distortion of markets. Tariffs mean we disagree. It very rarely means the disagreement will be resolved quickly. It usually means people will retaliate, and the escalation of that retaliation will hurt consumers, so much so that eventually someone will blink. The payers in this dispute, though, are never the government leaders. No, it's the workers who lose their job. It's the family that pay higher cost. It's the community that lose their economic activity and tax revenue. And that is why it is so important in this day and age that we talk more about the 3 C's: collaboration, capacity building, and coalitions. Capacity building gives us the ability to accelerate innovation. Trust me, one thing I know about traveling my state, I'm sure it's true in other places too. Innovation is not only in the DNA of Americans, it is the history of our country. Whether electricity, aviation, or the internet, credit goes to the United States of America for innovation and inventing future economic opportunities, not just for us, but for the entire world. But now we are in an innovation race defined by AI and quantum, and according to the World Economic Forum, the United States generative AI may increase gross domestic product between $2 and $4 trillion per decade. Boston Consulting estimates that quantum computing could generate $850 billion in annual revenue by 2040. So are we going to focus on those things, winning the races, or are we going to allow a contraction that hurts everyone? Obviously, going all in on AI and quantum can help ensure that our country maintains both economic and military advantages, but we definitely have to collaborate with like-minded nations who also want to grow AI and set the rules if you want to beat China's ultimate Belt and Road Initiative, DeepSeek. So, what do we do about the domestic impacts of trade? Well, I can tell you some sure don'ts right away. You don't abolish the Trade Adjustment Assistance Program designed to protect impacted workers from trade, which is what has happened with the other side of the aisle. We need to be intentionally upskilling workers to help them in impacted sectors. I have met and talked to so many Americans. They are smart, talented, hardworking, striving, and they only ask for one thing: opportunity. If you bet on them, they will do the rest. I often think, Mr. President, of 2 major shifts in workforce policy in the United States. World War II, where we didn't have a workforce and the women showed up in the factories and delivered production. And when the men returned from World War II and everybody wondered what the economy of the future would be, and we gave them the GI Bill, and they created it. So we don't cut workforce training. We invest in 2-year skill training programs at our high school. We make sure that we turn to apprenticeships. We return to the skilling of the jobs that are needed today. You also don't cut export programs like the State Trade Export Program, STEP, or the Export-Import Bank. But what do you do? Well, let's go back to those 3 C's: collaboration, coalition building, and capacity building. We will bring more high-wage manufacturing jobs back to the United States, fostering the investment landscape by continuing on the path of the CHIPS and Science Act and the bipartisan infrastructure bill. Those have put real investments in the United States of America and have started us on the path towards growing the middle class again. But we need to continue to invest in science. We need a robust R&D tax policy for inventors and manufacturers, and we need to help our manufacturers with capital investment, equipment modernizations to help them with their factories. I've seen this in places like Madison, Maine, or Longview, Washington, where we helped revitalize long-standing paper industry into new opportunities for the future. So how do we deal with China? Well, they aren't playing by the rule. They are manipulating and flooding markets. But I guarantee you that just a fear of China is not the answer. And solutions like collaboration and coalition building are critical, particularly in the information age. China does have the largest gross domestic product, about 19% of GDP. In the global economy, the U.S. represents about 15%. But if the United States works to create markets with like-minded partners like Japan, Europe, and the UK, and builds a coalition of like-minded democracies grounded in the rule of law, we can flip the script and have a market representing 34% of GDP. And if we take the next step and expand coalitions to include partners like Canada, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and India, then we're looking at a market that instead of China's 19% accounts for almost half, 47% of global GDP. So why aren't we focusing on that economic opportunity? A lot of people say, well, that's not the America of today. But I'm pretty sure Ben Franklin, about the time he was focusing on electricity, also went to France and helped build a coalition essential for the founding and continuation of our country. So don't tell me it's not in our DNA to do this. There is so much more we could and should do working with our allies. Obviously, I mentioned a few: research and development in artificial intelligence, commercializing quantum, scaling safe, affordable fusion technology. And there are many members of Congress who are working on these bipartisan ideas. But we have to remain competitive, and we cannot allow this debate about tariffs take us off our historical course as a nation. As I mentioned, we mapped out how to get investment in the United States of America. And now we need to follow that with the training and skilling of American workers. If the AFL-CIO president, Liz Schuler, and Microsoft president Brad Smith at a recent meeting in Seattle agreed we need to train and skill 500,000 electricians for the United States, why can't we here agree and accelerate that? I'm not even sure we can agree on the acceleration of air traffic controllers, and we have every reason to get that done. Last week, I spoke about additional investments the United States needs to make in Panama, Latin America, and others to modernize bilateral agreements that help us counter China. And as I mentioned, I believe in an aggressive Exim Bank investment to counter China's Belt and Road Initiative. Free trade agreements are a way for us, not tariffs, to gain the leverage we want. South Asia could play an important role in this coalition building, particularly in the Indo-Pacific region. But I want us to go further. I want us to understand that U.S.-led negotiations in a Middle East free trade agreement to build on the momentum of a ceasefire in Gaza could further stabilize that region. That investments in other programs, and Mr. President, it's tragic that the administration fails to understand the important role USAID plays in capacity building. Mr. President, it is not a tariff-first approach world. It is an information age driven by rapid change where your partners, your friends, your supply chains, getting the innovation implemented and moving faster than your adversary is the key. How will we know that strategy works? Well, I suggest we will know when we're growing the middle class in the United States of America again. Mr. President, the bills we have passed in investing and allowing us to innovate faster are on their way to doing that. Let us not have a trade war disrupt that and dismantle what has been history after history lesson of economic success of this nation, fighting for open markets, capital opportunities, and investing in the ingenuity of America. I thank the President, and I yield the floor.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Also Brooks.
President, the senator from California,
Suggest we suspend the quorum call.
without objection.
Mr. President, on roll call vote 26, I voted nay. It was my intention to vote aye. Therefore, I ask unanimous consent that I be permitted to change my vote since it will not affect the outcome.
Without objection.
Thank you.
Just seek recognition. I don't need to. Just seek recognition.
The senator from Missouri.
Thank you, Mr. President. I stand here to amplify my support that I was able to give in the Judiciary Committee of Pam Bondi, who will hopefully in a few short hours here be confirmed as the next Attorney General of the United States of America. I want to thank, before I do that, the leadership and the hard work of Leader Thune and Senate Majority Whip Barrasso in this entire confirmation process, working at a clip that I think is responsible and one that honors the mandate that President Trump got to shake things up here in Washington, D.C. I think what you saw in November was a dynamic where people weren't particularly happy with what was going on in this town. And they voted for reform. And President Trump is putting together a team of reformers. And look no further than an ideal place for that reform than the Department of Justice. But before I get there, I do want to point out on a personal note that when President Trump announced that he was supporting Pam Bondi, I think I'd said to somebody, this was a home run. And as many of us in this chamber are often outdone by Senator Graham, he described it as a grand slam, touchdown, hole-in-one, ace, hat trick, slam dunk, Olympic gold medal pick, and he was right. I've known Pam Bondi for years from AG World. That was my job before I had this job. I was the Attorney General in Missouri. And Pam was always known as a leader and somebody that has this really rare combination of a steel backbone and a heart of gold. She's in it for the right reasons. She cares about the rule of law. She started her career from humble beginnings in a small town in Florida, and she wanted to be a prosecutor. We heard in her testimony in the Judiciary Committee that was her goal, was to be a prosecutor, and she spent hours and years in those courtrooms prosecuting the bad guys. And she later became the Attorney General of one of our bigger states, and as I mentioned, she was a leader. She defended the Constitution. She took on the opioid epidemic. She was relentless in taking on human trafficking, and somebody I think that everybody can look up to, not just from a personal perspective and her personal story, but also the way that she took on her job and had accolades from both sides of the aisle. There was actually somebody in the Senate committee who was on the other side of the aisle in Florida that ran for Attorney General the same time Pam Bondi was running for Attorney General and testified to her character. There's just no question that she's supremely qualified for this job. And we're really going to need somebody as the Attorney General to lead the Department of Justice who has that kind of integrity, who believes in the Constitution, believes in individual rights, and getting that department back to where it always should have been, which is fighting crime. Sadly, over the last 4 years, we have seen a Department of Justice gone astray. One that has made headlines, of course, for going after parents who showed up to school board meetings under the auspices of the Patriot Act, treating moms and dads as terrorists, who went to a school board open forum meeting and had concerns about things like critical race theory or forced masking. The full weight of the federal government honed in on parents and Catholics who were treated the same way because they were traditional Catholics, literally setting up informant networks in an effort to spy on them because of their religious affiliation. I'm not talking about the Soviet Union in the 1980s. I'm talking about the United States of America in 2021. What Merrick Garland did to this agency in the Department of Justice is a tragedy. Kash Patel hopefully will move out of the Judiciary Committee here soon and be the next leader of the FBI and restore integrity to that agency as well. But of course, the Department of Justice that Pam Bondi hopefully in a few short hours will be confirmed and then sworn in to lead will restore integrity. In addition to going after Catholics, and in addition to going after families who show up to school board meetings, the very coordinated effort of lawfare by the past administration to take out their chief political rival under the moniker of show me the man and I'll show you the crime can't be dismissed. They're not going to want to talk about that. But the effort to financially ruin President Trump, to literally throw him in jail for the rest of his life, deserves the scorn of the history books. Joe Biden gave a speech in the fall of 2022 calling half of America a threat to democracy, that President Trump would never make it back to the Oval Office, and guess what happened? A series of zombie cases with at best novel legal theories were resurrected. In New York, the number 3 person at DOJ left the Department of Justice to join the DA's office in New York. Why would that person want to do that? Well, guess what? President Trump was prosecuted in a Manhattan courtroom not long after that. In state cases, the number 2 person in the DA's office in Atlanta was coordinating with the White House counsel's office on the prosecution of President Trump in Georgia. And then Jack Smith was brought in, who was notorious among legal circles for overzealous and over prosecutions, overcharging, was brought in specifically to take out President Trump. And it was only the Supreme Court ultimately that prevented that. But this was all a scheme devised by the Biden administration to make sure President Trump never got back into office. Well, guess what? He stared it all down, and he won. And we have a real opportunity now to have a level set. I don't think it's right that we have people pursued because of their politics from a criminal perspective. Nothing was out of bounds in the last 4 years by the Biden administration and Merrick Garland. So Pam Bondi is just the kind of person to come in, to restore integrity, to make sure that our Department of Justice is fighting on behalf of the American people and not an attempt, ironically, to undermine our republic, the very accusation that was leveled at Joe Biden's political opponent. And with that, Mr. President, I look forward to voting yes on Pam Bondi and having a real leader, somebody that we can look up to, lead that very important Department of Justice. I yield back.
Mr. President,
The Democratic Whip?
are we in a quorum call?
We are not.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, last week I came to the floor to talk about the chaos that has been created by the announced proposed freeze on federal funding and loans. I want to share a few stories about what I've seen and heard since I spoke on the floor last week. Sharpsburg is near my hometown of Springfield, Illinois, and it has a water system in Christian County. It's in phase 3 of construction of a rural water project. 18 miles of pipeline, which will provide water. Excuse me. There's no excuse for this. Sorry. That may be a first on the Senate floor. I apologize. It contains 18 miles of pipeline providing water to 50 new rural customers. The work is underway. The project is nearly complete, and it'll be in jeopardy if there is a freeze permitted to take effect. What does it mean? It means that these 50 homes and families will be without clean, safe, and affordable water. That is unacceptable. The freeze also means that scientists at universities across the state are worried about their jobs and research. Parents of children with disabilities are worried about losing resources for their kids. Adults are worried about losing access to health care and social services. Since then, not one but 2 judges have issued temporary restraining orders blocking President Trump's measure. As of yesterday evening, that pause has been extended. But let me remind you, this freeze is unconstitutional. The Constitution gives the power to Congress, not to the President, the power of the purse. And the President has no legal authority to withhold funding that was signed into law for Americans on a bipartisan basis. In the 1970s, former President Nixon tried to impound or withhold funding appropriated by Congress, and in response, Congress passed the Impoundment Control Act of 1974, ICA. ICA is still the law of the land, and it prohibits presidents from withholding funds unless Congress approves the decision through outlined procedures. But consider this. The current administration apparently does not care. The president and his people are ignoring the law, creating chaos in hopes that amidst the confusion, some part of his power grab will stick. He is testing the limits of how much he can chip away at our system of checks and balances. There are reports that unelected Elon Musk and his, quote, government efficiency team now have access to the payment systems of the United States Treasury, which is essentially the checkbook of the entire federal government. Elon Musk tweeted to say he's planning to cut $4 billion in federal spending every single day from now till September 30th. $4 billion a day. I'm appalled to see so many of my Senate Republican colleagues falling in line as President Trump and Mr. Musk attempt to strip Congress of our constitutional authority and cause this kind of pain to our constituents. And I'm disappointed to see so many of my Republican colleagues vote to advance the nomination of President Trump's pick to run the Office of Management and Budgeting, Russell Vought. If this funding stunt is any indication, he is not fit to run that office. The damage from the freeze extends beyond our shores. Bipartisan, congressionally appropriated funds to provide life-saving humanitarian aid and freedom in places like Venezuela, Iran, and North Korea have been ground to a halt. For example, programs like PEPFAR, started by President George W. Bush, and I give him credit for that, with the support of the evangelical community and its partner, the Global Fund, have dramatically curtailed the AIDS epidemic ravaging parts of the world. The program has saved more than 25 million lives. It has been so effective that some have forgotten just how devastating AIDS happened to be in that part of the world, killing more than 2 million a year globally, leaving 14 million orphans in sub-Saharan Africa. Further, USAID Clean Water and Sanitation have provided more than 70 million people with the first time sustainable access to clean water in the last decade. Programs that have a 6-to-1 return in dollars saved in health, economic, and educational terms. low-cost vaccination programs, eradicated smallpox, and almost eradicated polio from the face of the earth, something that was unimaginable just a generation ago. Food grown by American farmers helps save millions of lives when war or natural disaster strike. Gutting such programs puts innocent lives and American influence across the globe at risk. It is senseless, counterproductive, and ill-informed, and increases the likelihood of costlier interventions that don't respect borders, including pandemics, war, and failed states. The U.S. cannot and should not stand alone in the world. We are a global leader, and we have an obligation to continue to act like it. But over the weekend, in what sounded like a dystopian story from another world dictatorship, the Trump administration and Elon Musk tried to shutter the U.S. Agency for International Development without congressional approval. Try to imagine that disgraceful scene as one of the world's richest men gleefully guts programs for some of the world's poorest people. And don't be fooled. This isn't about reform, and the U.S. budget deficit won't be solved by gutting USAID. The foreign assistance budget is only 1% of our federal spending, a small, powerful investment that is not only the right thing to do, but the smart thing to do to prevent conflict and famine in failed states, as well as to build alliances and friends around the world. Gutting such programs is a betrayal of American values. Already nations like China sense a strategic opportunity. Under President Trump, when these programs go away, the Chinese will step in. Are Republicans going to roll over and cede congressional power to these bipartisan programs? I sincerely hope not. There's a lot at stake in the first few weeks of this new administration. I want to give the president a chance to show his values, but so far I have to tell you there's a lot of disappointment. This temporary freeze hurt a lot of innocent people, and this notion now of shutting down USAID, I can't imagine Elon Musk would have it on his conscience that so many helpless people would lose the basics in life for his budget plan. He wasn't elected to anything. And I think we should return to the Constitution, which still guides us today and should. I yield the floor and suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Also Brooks.
Mr. President, today
Quorum call
I would ask that the quorum call be vitiated.
without objection.
Mr. President, today we find ourselves in a pivotal moment in American history. And millions of Americans, by their actions or lack of action, will determine the future of our country for decades. In my view, the Trump administration is moving this country very aggressively into an oligarchic form of society where extraordinary power rests in the hands of a small number of unelected multi-billionaires. The Trump administration is moving this country very aggressively into an authoritarian society where the rule of law and our Constitution are being ignored and undermined in order to give more power to the White House and the billionaires who now control our government. The Trump administration is moving this country very rapidly toward a kleptocracy, where the function of government is not to serve the needs of ordinary people, but to enrich those who are in power. Mr. President, I think that today is a very good day to recall what one of our great presidents said at Gettysburg in November of 1863. Looking out at a battlefield where thousands of Union soldiers had just sacrificed their lives in the defense of freedom and the ending of slavery, Abraham Lincoln famously stated, and I quote, "The world will no longer remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did, the soldiers did here. It is for us, the living, rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain." And this is how he concluded: "That this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth." Government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Mr. President, I fear very much that under President Trump, we are not seeing a government of the people, by the people, for the people, but rather a government of the billionaire class, by the billionaire class, and for the billionaire class. And what is really interesting is that none of this is happening behind closed doors. It's not being done in secret. It's right out there for everybody to see. Several weeks ago, Donald Trump was inaugurated for a second term as president. Standing right behind him were the three richest men in America: Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, and Mark Zuckerberg. Combined, these three men are worth $920 billion. These three men own more wealth than the bottom half of American society, 170 million people. Three guys, 170 million people. And I should point out, and this should tell you exactly where we are going as a nation, these three men, wealthiest three in America, have become some $232 billion richer since Trump was elected a few weeks ago. Three guys, $232 billion richer since Trump was elected. Mr. President, this is how an oligarchic system works. Elon Musk, the wealthiest person in the world and now a key part of the Trump administration, spent over $277 million to get Trump elected. In other words, within a corrupt campaign finance system, which allows billionaires to spend as much as they want, he helped buy the election for Mr. Trump. Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg, the second and third wealthiest people in our country, both kicked $1 million each into Trump's inauguration fund. And let us remember that Mr. Bezos, who among other things owns the Washington Post, rescinded the endorsement of that paper for Kamala Harris just before the election. Mr. Bezos was showing early on that he was willing to bend the knee for Donald Trump. Mark Zuckerberg, the founder and CEO of Meta, which owns Facebook and Instagram, agreed to settle a lawsuit with Trump for $25 million. These three multi-billionaires are working with Trump for one very simple reason. They understand that Trump's policies are designed to make the very wealthiest people in this country even richer. Since Trump's election, Mr. Musk has become $154 billion richer. Not bad in a couple of weeks' time. He earned a great investment. He only spent a couple of $100 million on the election, and now he's $154 billion richer. Mr. Bezos has become $35 billion richer, and Mr. Zuckerberg has become $43 billion richer. Mr. President, I am concerned not only about the growing movement toward oligarchy in this country, but I am deeply worried that under the leadership of President Trump, we are moving rapidly towards authoritarianism. And all over this country, people are alarmed and shocked by what they have seen in the last several weeks. Just a few examples, just a few. Last week, President Trump attempted to suspend all federal grants and loans in direct violation of the U.S. Constitution and federal law. As every third grader in America knows, or I hope knows, the power of the purse in the United States belongs to Congress, not the president. Yes, the president can recommend legislation to Congress. The president can veto legislation that Congress has passed. But he does not have the power to unilaterally terminate funding and legislation that has been passed by the U.S. Congress. That is a dangerous and blatantly unconstitutional act. And I should add that Trump's blocking of federal funding would have had a horrific impact on millions of Americans who utilize programs like Medicaid, Head Start, community health centers, Meals on Wheels, homeless veterans programs, and many, many other initiatives. Tens of millions of Americans, including some of the most vulnerable in our country, were impacted by that decision. But that's not all. A few days ago, Trump fired 17 inspectors general, independent government watchdogs that were created by Congress in the wake of the Watergate scandal to prevent the abuse of power by the executive branch. Last week, President Trump fired a member of the National Labor Relations Board, and in so doing, effectively neutered the only federal agency in America with the authority to hold corporations accountable for illegal union busting and to protect the constitutional right of millions of workers who want to join unions in order to earn better wages, working conditions, and benefits. Not only is that move blatantly illegal, it is exactly what Elon Musk, the owner of Tesla, and Jeff Bezos, the owner of Amazon, have been fighting for months. They don't like unions. And what Mr. Trump has given them is the opportunity to make it much, much harder for workers to organize in their companies. President Trump also illegally fired members of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the only independent commission in our country that protects workers against discrimination in the workforce. Further, and what should upset every American, no matter whether you're conservative, moderate, progressive, is that in direct violation of the Constitution and federal law, Trump is intimidating the media with lawsuits against ABC, CBS, Meta, and the Des Moines Register. His FCC is now threatening to investigate PBS and NPR. What Trump is essentially saying to every media outlet in America, if you say or do anything that is critical of me, that displeases me, you may be subject to a lawsuit or a federal investigation. If that is not a direct attack on the First Amendment, on the U.S. Constitution and free speech in our country, I don't know what is. But that is not all. Elon Musk and his unelected minions at Doge have forced out officials at the Treasury Department and illegally shut down USAID, a program which, among other things, helps feed and provide medical help to starving and desperate children all over the world. Presidents, much less unelected billionaires, do not have the unilateral right to shut down federal agencies established by Congress. And when we talk about the very dangerous movement towards authoritarianism that we are seeing in this country now, let us not forget Trump's pardoning of the January 6th insurrectionists who injured 174 police officers right here, right outside this floor. Even worse, not only did he pardon those people, but Trump is undermining the FBI by actually investigating the agents there who helped bring these violent criminals to justice. Imagine that. Pardoning the people who broke the law and investigating the people who upheld the law. That is not what America is supposed to be about. And Mr. President, under Trump, we are rapidly moving toward a kleptocracy as well. Just before the president was inaugurated, he and his wife launched their own cryptocurrency coins, giving them the potential to earn many billions of dollars. If Wall Street CEOs tried to bribe the president with a bag full of money, that would be illegal. That's against the law. But now they don't have to do that. Today, if a multi-billionaire, the head of a foreign country, wants to curry favor with the president, all they have to do is buy his cryptocurrency coins, and when they do that, they are directly enriching Mr. Trump. So, Mr. President, the question that millions of Americans are asking is, given the move toward oligarchy, given the move toward authoritarianism, given the movement toward kleptocracy, where do we go from here? What should we as Americans be doing? And let me tell you what I think and what most Americans think. And that is, instead of moving toward an economy which is designed to benefit the very richest people in our country, we have got to create an economy and a government that works for all of us, not just for Mr. Musk or Mr. Bezos or Mr. Zuckerberg. Mr. President, at a time of massive wealth and income inequality, we have never had more income and wealth inequality than we have had right now. It is beyond stupidity to provide more tax breaks to the very richest people in our country and then to pay for those tax breaks by cutting back on Medicaid and other programs desperately needed by working families all across this country. That is what we should not be doing. But let me take a moment to tell you what we should be doing. At a time when 85 million Americans are uninsured or underinsured in our broken healthcare system, we have got to do what every other major country on earth does, and that is guarantee health care to all people as a human right, not a privilege. That's what we've got to do. At a time when 1 out of 4 Americans cannot afford the outrageously high prices that the pharmaceutical industry charges, we have got to end the absurdity of the American people paying by far the highest prices in the world for prescription drugs. We have got to cut the cost of medicine in this country in half, making it comparable with what the rest of the world is paying. Mr. President, the federal minimum wage today is $7.25 an hour. That is a starvation wage. Well, 60% of our people, 60% of Americans live paycheck to paycheck. We must raise that minimum wage to a living wage, at least $17 an hour. If you work 40 hours a week in the richest country on earth, you should not be living in poverty. Mr. Musk and Mr. Bezos want to make it harder for workers to join unions. Well, we have got to do exactly the opposite. Make it easier for workers to join unions by passing the PRO Act. At a time when we need the best educated workforce in the world, we need to have the best public schools in the world. And among other things, that means we need to substantially raise teachers' salary. We need to attract the best and the brightest young people into education, and we do that, among other things, by making sure that no teacher in America earns less than $60,000 a year. We also radically reform our broken child care system so the little kids in this country get the quality care they need and the workers there are adequately compensated. Mr. President, all over this country, from Vermont to LA, we have a major housing crisis. And it's not just the 800,000 Americans who are homeless. It's millions of working families who are spending 40, 50, or 60% of their limited incomes on housing. Instead of spending almost $1 trillion a year on a wasteful and bloated Pentagon budget, we have got to build millions of units of low-income and affordable housing. And when we do that, we put large numbers of American workers to work at good-paying union jobs. Mr. President, I have heard time and again from Mr. Trump's supporters that the president won the election and he has been given this huge mandate, just an overwhelming mandate to do whatever he wants. Well, no president has the right to move us to oligarchy, authoritarianism, or kleptocracy. But more important, let us not forget that while Trump did win this election, he actually received 4 million votes fewer votes than Biden did in 2020 when Biden won the election. So here we are. Where do we go? What do we do? I think now is the time for the American people to come together, to not allow those who want to divide us up by the color of our skin or our sexual orientation or where we were born. That's what they want to do. They want to divide us up. Now is the time for us to come together like never before and make certain we do not move toward oligarchy make certain we do not move toward authoritarianism or a kleptocracy. And most importantly, in the richest country in the history of the world, we must understand that we have the capability of providing a decent life for all of our people. We can do that when we stand together and we don't let folks divide us up. And with that, Mr. President, I would yield the floor.
Recognize the senator from Iowa.
Before I speak, I've been asked by leadership to make this request unanimous. I have 4 requests for committees to meet during today's session of the Senate. They have the approval of the majority and minority leaders.
Duly noted.
In a few minutes, probably shortly, I should say, we'll vote to confirm Pam Bondi as the Attorney General of the United States. Before we do, I'd like to speak in support of her nomination, and in doing that, urge my colleagues to vote for her, hopefully in a bipartisan way like we had for Garland under Biden administration. Ms. Bondi has been nominated to one of the most important offices in our country, and she's shown that she's up to that task. Her impressive record and presentation at her hearing are proof that she's ready to take the helm of the Justice Department. Ms. Bondi made history in 2010 as the first woman elected to be Florida's Attorney General. She held this role for 8 years after she was comfortably reelected by the people of Florida to that second term. 8 years of service as Attorney General of the third largest state in this union is excellent preparation for the role of Attorney General of the United States. As Florida's Attorney General, Ms. Bondi was a member of the Florida Cabinet, its chief legal officer, and led a very large agency. She handled many issues at the state level that she'll be handling at the federal level. And by all accounts, she's handled these jobs expertly. As Attorney General, Ms. Bondi didn't shy away from hard work or complicated problems. She engaged in an aggressive campaign to eliminate pill mills, take a leading role in securing a $303.25 billion settlement following the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, and eliminated the backlog of rape kits. She also stood for law and order and sought justice for victims of violent criminals. Her record shows then that she's highly qualified to be Attorney General of the United States. During her confirmation hearing, Ms. Bondi answered questions for more than 5 hours. What we learned during her hearing reinforced what we knew from her existing record as Attorney General of Florida. She's a tough, fair career prosecutor who built her reputation by enforcing the rule of law. Pretty simple. We also heard from witnesses who praised Ms. Bondi's character, fairness, and willingness to work with members of both parties to solve the problems in Florida. And we're sure she's going to work the same way as Attorney General of the United States. So what did we hear from these witnesses? We heard from an elected Democrat who never voted for President Trump. He said Ms. Bondi was fair, tethered to the rule of law, and could work with both Democrats and Republicans to serve the American people. We heard from Florida's statewide prosecutor, who praised her competence running the legal department, as I've said, of the third largest state in the union. We heard from a Florida sheriff who testified about her commitment to law and order and to her partnership with law enforcement to keep Floridians safe. These witnesses have worked with Ms. Bondi for decades, and they all vouch for her capability and character. Ms. Bondi's nomination has also received a flood of support from all across America. So I have a group of people here that have expressed their view through letter to the committee. Law enforcement groups representing more than 650,000 officers wrote to urge us to support Ms. Bondi's nomination. A few of these groups included the National Association of Police Organizations, the Fraternal Order of Police, the National Sheriff's Association, major county sheriffs, National Narcotic Officers Association, the International Association of Chiefs of Police, and still some others. This support is a testament to Ms. Bondi's history of backing the blue. We should all be backing the blue. I just met with some law enforcement people just before coming over here, and I tell every one of them, I'm not for defunding the police, and thank you for keeping the peace. We've also received letters of support from more than 100 former senior Department of Justice officials, scores of former U.S. attorneys, dozens of state attorneys general, women's rights groups, Second Amendment groups, and of course others. Between her record, her presentation in committee, and the support she's received from across the country, I'm convinced that Ms. Bondi is the right choice. So, when confirmed, Ms. Bondi will take the helm of what we all know is a turbulent time and also a Justice Department infected with political decision-making and its leaders refusing to acknowledge that reality. In other words, political decision-making, at least on the 7th floor of the Hoover Building, overtaking the major role of the FBI, and the FBI is part of the Justice Department. They aren't putting first things first. So here are a few examples of political decision-making and infection in the department. Crossfire hurricane. Secondly, the Justice Department's targeting my staff, yeah, that's right, my investigative staff, who at the time was investigating at my direction the government's abuse of Crossfire hurricane. Thirdly, cover-up of the Hunter Biden laptop story and sweetheart plea deals offered by the Department of Justice to Hunter Biden. Fourth, the FBI's inappropriate briefing to me and Senator Johnson during our Biden family investigation that was later leaked, and nothing's supposed to be leaked from what we call the SCIF. Fifth, Special Counsel Jack Lawfare's operation. In other words, trying to put now President Trump in jail. Sixth, the targeting of traditional Catholics, concerned parents, and abortion protesters as security threats. And seventh, the coordination of censorship of political speeches. And I don't have an 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th, but they exist. I'm not going to take your time on that. Now, all of these things that I mentioned, plus things I haven't mentioned, are very serious breaches of the public trust. And we can't tolerate that sort of breach. I'm confident Ms. Bondi will not tolerate that breach. And I'm looking forward to working with her to shed sunlight on these abuses. And sunlight, as some Supreme Court justice said, is the best attack against, oh my gosh, I forgot exactly what it was, but sunshine is supposed, coming in will really solve a lot of problems. This is the way I put it. I say we need more transparency in government, and transparency brings accountability. Now, I've already released new FBI records. In fact, just last week with Senator Johnson that show even more political violence biased within the Justice Department and the FBI. These records prove that former FBI special agent in charge, Thibault, a known anti-Trump agent, authored the initial language for what ultimately became Jack Smith's federal case against Trump regarding the 2020 presidential election. That case was codenamed Arctic Frost. Now, I don't know where they get the name Arctic Frost, but that's what the case was called. These records that we released last week showed a scheme in place between the Justice Department and FBI officials to get Trump. I had to rely on brave whistleblowers to uncover the truth because I was stonewalled by the Justice Department and the FBI. And I was stonewalled even after they promised at their own confirmation hearing that they would answer the letters that congressmen wrote them. We never got any answers. In fact, there's 58 answers in the last 4 years I've written to the FBI on my investigations that I have not gotten answers to. So, if you wonder why I'm so passionate about Pam Bondi, I'm confident that she's going to take a different approach, and she says yes for answering our letters. It'll be yes instead of what the other people should have said at the answer to that question is maybe. As the recent terrorist attacks in New Orleans and around the world have shown, we're faced with very serious threats to our national security. The president needs his team in place to protect our country, and the American people deserve a secure homeland and borders, safe streets, and orderly markets. We need to swiftly confirm a capable and serious Attorney General to get to work. Now, I'm disappointed that none of my Democrat colleagues on the Judiciary Committee voted for Ms. Bondi in committee. I hope it'll be different when we get to the full Senate. We had a bipartisan vote, as I've said previously, for Attorney General Garland. Maybe on hindsight we shouldn't have had, but we did have. There's no doubt that Ms. Bondi is highly qualified. In committee, several of my Democrat colleagues even acknowledged as much. She's qualified for the job. She represents mainstream views shared by at least the 77 million Americans who voted for change on November 5th. This should earn her the same bipartisan support this body gave Attorney General Garland, so that's the third time I've said that. My colleagues will not cross the If my colleagues will not cross the aisle to vote for this qualified nominee, they'll show that Senate Democrats are intent on opposing President Trump's cabinet picks for purely partisan reasons, even at the same time they admit how fully qualified she is to do the job. So ending now, I say once again, I proudly support Ms. Bondi, look forward to confirming her. She's ready and able to serve our country well, and I know she'll work with President Trump to restore faith in the Justice Department. I urge all of my colleagues to join me in confirming Ms. Bondi. I yield.
Now I recognize the senator from New Hampshire.
Mr. President, I'm happy to be on the floor this afternoon with my colleague from New England, Senator Welch from Vermont. We are neighboring states that have been spooning for a very long time. But we're here today to talk about a very serious issue, and that is the tariffs that President Trump is talking about imposing on Canada, goods from Canada and Mexico, and the impact that will have on Americans. On Saturday, President Trump announced a 25% tariff, which would be a tax on imported goods from Canada and Mexico, and a 10% tariff, which would amount to a tax on imported energy from Canada and on all goods from China, so 10% on all goods from China and a 10% on energy from Canada. He's also threatened universal tariffs on all countries. Now, thankfully, the tariffs that he announced on Canada and Mexico appear to have been delayed for a month, but the tariff taxes on China are now in effect. And even though many of these tariff taxes were delayed, they're still scheduled to go into effect next month, and they've created unnecessary panic and uncertainty among businesses and families across the country and in New Hampshire. Now, I want to point out in the beginning very clearly that it's not foreign countries who pay these taxes, these tariff taxes. It's Americans who pay these tariff taxes. These are tariff taxes on imported goods, meaning that the person or company who's importing the good will be footing the bill, and these costs will be passed on to American consumers and businesses. And you don't have to take my word for it. Best Buy's CEO said, and I quote, "The vast majority of that tariff will probably be passed on to the consumer as a price increase." And Walmart's CFO said, "There will probably be cases where prices will go up for consumers." Columbia Sportswear's CEO said about tariffs, "We're set to raise prices, and it's going to be very, very difficult to keep products affordable." Now, if we look at the cost of just the tariff taxes that were originally announced on Saturday, those would raise costs for the average American household by more than $1,200 a year. And if we get into a trade war with increasingly high tariffs on both sides, and that's what it appears could be happening with China, those costs will go up even more. Now, President Trump campaigned on a promise to lower prices for everything. The tariffs that he's talking about would have the exact opposite effect. I'm glad the administration and the president listened to reason. He delayed the start of these tariffs, but I hope we don't have to be back here in a few weeks making this case again. And I want to make sure that people understand what these tariff taxes would do and highlight some of the areas where Americans would be directly affected. First is energy. America imports more oil and gas from Canada than from any other product. In New Hampshire, more than half of the gas in people's cars comes from Canada. These tariff taxes would make gas prices go up, and they could even lead to supply shortages because refinery and delivery infrastructure just doesn't turn on a dime. President Trump's new 10% tariff tax on energy from Canada would also directly raise the cost of keeping warm for Granite Staters during the coldest months of this year. In New Hampshire, our #1 import from Canada is heating oil. And nearly 250,000 households in New Hampshire, that's about 40% of our households, more than Vermont, I think, Senator Welch, rely on fuel oil to heat their homes. We're the second highest state in the nation, next to Maine, who relies on #2 heating oil to heat our homes. Another 100,000 Granite Staters rely on propane, and about 30,000 homes use wood. So that's about 60% of New Hampshire that relies on delivered fuel to stay warm. Much of that is coming from Canada. The average home in New Hampshire on heating oil uses about 600 gallons in a winter. And for older, draftier homes, and sadly we have a lot of those in New Hampshire, or those who are further up north, families may be using upwards of 1,000 gallons a winter. And with temperatures dipping as low as 20 below zero in the state in recent weeks, heating oil is a real necessity. And my constituents are already getting notices. I don't know, Senator Welch, if the same is true of your constituents, but I bet it is. But they're saying that those notices tell them their costs are going to go up if these tariffs go into effect. On Sunday, I heard from Derek in Sandwich, New Hampshire, who received a letter from his heating supplier, Irving Oil, that informed him that his bill for heating oil would be going up. The letter stated, "As you may be aware, the U.S. government has announced a new tariff on imports from Canada, including the heating oil or propane that Irving Energy delivers to you. And the letter went on to describe that the tariff costs will be added to the price that he pays, even though he already has a contract. As Derek wrote to me, I will now have less to spend locally. My local businesses will suffer through lost business and increased costs, and then their suppliers and employees will suffer. It's a real hardship. On Inauguration Day this year, heating oil cost an average of $3.93 a gallon in New Hampshire. Tacking an ill-advised 10% tariff tax on heating oil from Canada could mean about $150 to $250 more for many in New Hampshire just to keep warm through the winter. And while for Elon Musk and his billionaire friends and the billionaire friends of the president, $150 to $250 may not sound like a lot in a winter, but there are a lot of people in New Hampshire for whom $150 to $250 is the difference between staying warm and being cold in the winter. So let me also be clear. We don't use gas and heating oil from Canada because we don't produce it here in the United States. We do it because it makes logistical and economic sense, because in New England, we are at the end of the pipelines that are coming from Texas and the South. Now, the United States produces more oil than any other country in the history of the world. That was true during the last 3 years of the first Trump administration. It was true for the last 4 years of the Biden administration. But for New Hampshire, the St. John refinery in Canada simply provides us the closest, lowest cost supply. And by the way, that refinery sources as much as half of its crude oil from the United States. So it's helping oil producers in the United States send their oil to the refinery, and we get it back in New Hampshire and New England. President Trump campaigned on cutting energy prices in half. Reckless tariffs on Canada and Mexico would make those prices higher, not lower. New Hampshire families shouldn't be punished for what the Wall Street Journal has just called the dumbest trade war in history. And that's not all. These tariff taxes will affect groceries, because the U.S. imports 38% of our fresh vegetables, 60% of our fresh fruit, and more than 99% of the coffee that we drink. If we take all these together, Americans could be seeing an extra $200 a year on their grocery bills because of the Trump tariff tax. That doesn't include the longer-term impact of taxes on farm equipment or fertilizer. America imports about 85% of the potash fertilizer we use, and much of that comes from Canada. Now, we already have record high prices for coffee and eggs, if you can find eggs. Some grocery stores are sold out. And one of the things that just happened in the last week is that because of the stop work order that President Trump put on our services that we provide overseas to track bird flu, we're no longer tracking the bird flu that has helped drive up the cost of eggs. So it could get worse, and we're not even going to know about it until we see those prices reflected at the grocery store. Now, any new 25% tariff tax on these imports would make our food more expensive at a time when families are already stretching and straining their household budgets. Tariffs sometimes get talked about as a way to support American manufacturers, but that also misses the mark. Half of the products the U.S. imports are either raw materials or intermediate components, and that means the parts we make into cars or electronics. All of these inputs would get more expensive for American manufacturers, which is only going to make it harder for them to compete internationally. One of the messages I hear regularly from businesses is that uncertainty is one of the hardest things for them to deal with. One example of this is a call I got 2 weeks ago from a small business owner in New Hampshire who sells specialized agricultural equipment, both in the U.S. and overseas. This is a family business with 5 employees. His father founded it 50 years ago. And he reached out specifically because he's worried about what tariffs on the components he buys from Canada could do to his business. For the specialized equipment that he needs, there aren't a lot of manufacturers out there. So he reached out to my office, asking if he was going to have to pay $5,000 more in costs for each of the machines he sells. He took over this business just a couple of years ago, and he's been working to invest to modernize it and expand. Now he has to worry about whether he can try to grow the business, whether he might face new foreign competition, or even if he can pay out bonuses or give raises to his employees. He can't even be certain what kind of pricing schedule he should send out for the year, because his costs could go up $5,000 next month. And last week I heard from another small business, Granite State Packing. It's a startup meat processing company that's only 2 years old. They started just 2 years ago, and they already have 10 employees. Last year, they actually got $1.6 million in a grant from USDA to expand their operations. That's going to allow them to double their workforce. In order to expand, they placed an order for $500,000 in new equipment, because the specialized equipment that they use isn't made in the United States. Now, depending on how and when these tariffs go into effect, and when their equipment might get delivered, they could be looking at a bill, an increased bill for $125,000. That's going to affect whether they can follow through on the expansion, whether they can actually add the staff they want to add, and they don't have any way of knowing if they're going to face an unexpected $125,000 bill, because President Trump and this administration hasn't made up their mind what they're going to do about these tariffs. Over the weekend, I had another business owner from C&J Bus Lines. They run a great bus line from the seacoast of New Hampshire to Boston. The owner told me that they've ordered 7 buses from Quebec, new buses, because they're made in Quebec. These tariffs would add $150,000 to the cost of each bus. Now, between that and the higher fuel costs that they would pay, they could be looking at $1.3 million more in added costs this year because of the Trump tariff tax. No small business can easily just absorb a 25% price increase, nor can they plan on how to grow their business and keep providing good-paying jobs with this kind of uncertainty. So, make no mistake, I'm glad the administration delayed these tariffs. I hope they understand how this action would affect America's small businesses and the impact this would have on the economy. And let me finally just talk about housing impacts, because New Hampshire has an affordable housing crisis. These tariffs would make that worse. Lumber makes up about 15% of the cost of building a house, and a lot of building materials, in addition to lumber, are imported. The National Association of Home Builders wrote, in part, and I quote, "Imposing additional tariffs on these imports will ultimately be passed on to home buyers in the form of increased housing prices." That means that this 25% tariff tax would directly add to the cost of building a home at a time when too many Granite Staters and too many Americans across the country already can't afford housing. And we shouldn't pretend that American tariffs are going to go unanswered. Other countries are going to retaliate, and getting into a tit-for-tat trade war is not going to help working Americans pay their bills. Families across New Hampshire and America are worried about the high costs of housing, about the cost of groceries, about what it costs to heat their homes. Business owners are similarly worried about costs or unexpected expenses. I'm hearing regularly from them about the impact of the uncertainty on their ability to grow their businesses because of these tariffs. President Trump promised during his campaign, I'm quoting here, to lower the price of everything. But instead of doing something to lower costs, what he's doing now, what his administration is doing, is planning to add a 25% tariff tax to countless imports from Canada and Mexico. And they've already added a 10% tariff tax on goods coming in from China. And again, while this was delayed at the last minute, this would raise costs for everything from groceries to housing to energy. It would disproportionately hit lower-income families. I'm glad for the delay. I don't want people to misunderstand that. But how is a business or a family supposed to plan when they don't know if important costs like gas or heating or groceries are going to spike any day? I want to finish by reading a quote here. The quote says, "Tariffs are inflationary and would strengthen the dollar, hardly a good starting point for a U.S. industrial renaissance." That's a quote from Scott Bessent, the new Treasury Secretary, who just got confirmed when he wrote to his investors just a year ago. I happen to agree with what he said then, but unfortunately the administration he just joined seems to be willing to risk more inflation. These sweeping tariff tax increases would hurt American families, businesses, and workers. I'm glad the taxes on goods from Canada and Mexico were delayed. I hope this administration can provide everyone with certainty that they won't go into effect next month. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield to my colleague from Vermont.
I now recognize the senator from Vermont.
Everything my colleague, the senior senator from New Hampshire, said about New Hampshire and how people are really struggling to pay their bills, the cost of rent, the cost of housing, home heating fuel in the winter, it's been brutal, groceries. That is totally the same situation for families in Vermont, and it is around the country. And I can't add, really, to the recitation of the practical consequences that this has on businesses and on Vermont families, beyond what Senator Shaheen said. But it really, it mystifies Vermonters. People come up to me and they say, "Peter, seriously? This is going to increase our grocery prices? This is going to mean lumber is more expensive? This is going to mean home heating fuel, and we rely on Canadian gas probably more than you do, but also home heating fuel. This is going to raise our prices." In that $150 to $200 you're talking about, that's real, that's real money. And they just are mystified that we would, through the president, increase their monthly bills. And for what reason? I want to talk a little bit about that. New Hampshire and Vermont, we mostly get along, but we're rivals in hockey and other things. But we both have incredibly close relationships with Canada. They're our friends. In Vermont, we have a library in Derby, Vermont, that's half in Vermont and half in New Hampshire. And our kids are going back and forth to play hockey. And that's just on a very personal level, the affection that we have for Canada and they have for us. They come down and ski in our mountains. They come down and visit. We go up there. And there's an element of, "Peter, what's going on? National security is the reason you're doing this? Is there a threat from Canada to our national security?" We know there isn't. So this is an arbitrary decision that is made by the president, in my view, abusing authority that Congress gave him to use tariffs if there is, in fact, a national security threat, which all of us in a common sense way would think it might be something from a military threat, or it might be from the coercive economic policies that we face from China. There's a legitimate case there for national security, but Canada has been in the trenches with us in every war that we've had. They have been by our side. They're our friends. And, that's another thing people ask. "Peter, you don't treat your friends this way. You just don't do that." So I had a concern. Come here. I'm trying to find my glasses. about what the impact was on Vermont. And instead of me speculating about it, I'm looking for just 1 minute, here it is. Instead of me speculating about it, Mr. President, what we did is invited some Vermonters who have businesses, some Vermont families, come and tell us what's going to happen if we have these tariffs. And let me tell you some of what they said. We met in St. Albans, which is a few miles from the Canadian border. And I asked these businesses, just tell us what happens. First of all, there was nobody in these businesses who said that the cost of this tariff would not be passed on to the consumer, all right? Common sense. It's like somehow if there's a 25% increase in cost, the business can just eat it, when we know, especially our small businesses, they're operating on the margin. They're doing every single thing they can to make their product competitive and affordable for the people they're serving. These are really, really good people who are totally committed to the communities that they're in. Every one of them said, whatever the cost of the tariff is, that is going to be passed on to the consumer. Not that they like to do that, but they have to pay their own bills. It's just reality. The second thing they talked about was the uncertainty that occurs for businesses. One business was talking about how when these tariffs goes in, and by the way, we have some history with this in the last Trump administration. There was supposedly a tariff, but if you knew the back entrance into the White House and could make a connection with somebody who had influence, you could get an exemption. So you get this terrible situation, which is not going to be available, by the way, for our Vermont fuel dealers or our Vermont home builders. If you know somebody, you somehow got out of the tariff, and there's no guidance about how these tariffs would have been rolled out. So there was an enormous opportunity for special treatment to be given. But even then, the complexity of this, like for instance, one manufacturer was talking about if you got a certain kind of aluminum, it was subject to the tariff. But if you got an ever so slightly different definition of aluminum, that you wouldn't be subject to the tariff. So you have a whole production process that has been using aluminum A that would be subject to a tariff. And if you go to aluminum B, if you can find it, it won't be subject to a tariff. If you got a square panel, it would be subject. If it was rectangular, you wouldn't. I mean, this is truly bizarre because there's no common sense in this at all. So I keep asking the question, why? Why are we doing this? Why are we inflicting this complexity on our businesses? Why are we inflicting this cost on our consumers and on our business? And there's no justification for it once at all. So let me go through some of the stories, Mr. President. Garrick Herchak at Manufacturing Solutions. They do precision machining. You know, they're a manufacturer. That's what we want. And there's no margins on it. They work with sheet metal and cardboard. And he said these tariffs create a whole burden to determine what is tariffed, the type or shape of aluminum, and he is bracing to respond to whatever chaos comes next. And this company has been in business for 29 years, and it employs 275 people. That is a big deal in our state of Vermont. Big deal. Why mess with him? Why? Rock Gollin at Water Innovations. They make, we have better maple syrup than New Hampshire, I'm sorry to say, and definitely better than Canada. They make the equipment that's used in maple syrup production. And this is going to increase their cost and threaten jobs. And it really does threaten jobs, okay? And then if you lose a market, by the way, then it's hard to get it back. So this company, where it might face this huge increase in cost of aluminum to manufacture its products, could lose market share and not be able to claw their way back. Mike Tatro from Poulin Grain. Poulin Grain is a great Franklin County family-run, actually Northeast Kingdom too, family-run grain dealer. They've been around for generations. And they've paid a huge contribution in keeping our dairy farms going. They import organic grain, huge market in Vermont. Their products are heavy to transport. Think of corn and canola and oats. So they need to buy nearby, and they buy from Canada. And important, it's 30 to 40% of what they buy, and these tariffs could cost them about $10 million. And it's just like the fuel dealers. You know, they've got a contract, but they honor their customers. They can't eat $10 million. It just can't be done. So the Poulin family is really worried about the cost rising for farmers who are on a thinnest of thin margins, and nobody works harder than our dairy farmers. That is hard work, but it's so important to us in the state of Vermont that we give them every chance to succeed when they're facing tough odds every day. And why in the world would an act of the President of the United States add to the burden these dairy farmers already face when they're trying to hang on? It's just, it doesn't make any sense to me. He also said something that Mike said, something that's really important. You know, the unknown and uncertainty, it's very difficult. There seems to be a point of view in the Trump administration, president, I'll be candid, that he thinks chaos is a good negotiating tool. I'll leave it to others to decide their view on that. But if the chaos creates this uncertainty for the Poulin Grain Company, for the dairy farmers in Franklin County, for a family that is hoping they can build a house and they thought they had a price, for a family that's struggling to pay their groceries at the end of the month, that uncertainty is really an infliction of distress that's unfair and unreasonable. And to create uncertainty in everyday people who are trying to live in their community, do a good job for the people that they serve, families that are trying to do their contribution in the community and keep the well-being of their family together, and they're on a tight margin, it's cruel to inflict unnecessarily uncertainty. You know, the people from Vermont, the people from New Hampshire, and I think this is true around the country, they're okay with facing hard and grim circumstances. And they'll grit their way through it. And they'll take care of their kids. And they'll take care of their community. And they'll be generous. But you know what? When the hardship that is something they have to deal with is a hardship that has been arbitrarily inflicted upon them by authorities or powers in Washington, in this case the president, and in my view, totally improper invocation of so-called national security with our biggest ally, Canada, then they start to wonder. That makes the burden even more and more difficult. So another person that was there, Sarah Meerhoff, was a representative of the general contractors of Vermont, and they do all the building. They've been incredible with the infrastructure challenges we've had after Tropical Storm Irene, that was a while ago, and then the floods we had in July of 23, and then again in July of 24. The cost of raw materials is already very expensive, and she quoted one of her members, Kevin Moyer from Vermont Frame, who said, "Tariffs have always been bad for everyone. As a business owner who buys a lot of timber from Canada, I'm very worried about the impact of tariffs on my company. I cannot absorb these costs and will have to push them through to my clients in the form of price increases, which will make my company less competitive versus other construction techniques like conventional framing." So I keep asking myself, why are we doing this to folks who are so essential to the well-being of the communities that we represent? And by the way, you've got two border state senators here. We have a lot in common, but everything we've said applies to similar businesses in every single state in the country. So this is not a Republican-Democratic deal. These tariffs are going to cost our families that you represent, Mr. President, that as the senior senator from New Hampshire represent, that I represent, it's going to cost them more money And for what? What are we getting in return? So, Mr. President, I too am very relieved, actually, on behalf of the people of Vermont and the people in New Hampshire and the people of this country, that there's been a temporary pause in these tariffs. But the uncertainty goes on. There will be no more justification in 30 days from now to impose these tariff taxes on Vermonters and on New Hampshireites than there is today. And today there's no justification, and in 30 days there'll be no justification. And I would call upon the President to get real in accepting the consequences to everyday families, to small businesses. These aren't billionaires. These are really hardworking people in Vermont, in New Hampshire, and they just rightly don't understand this. So, yes, it's good the tariffs have been suspended. It's really bad that they were ever threatened to be imposed. They will never do any good when there's a bogus reason, so-called national security, and a real abuse of that authority by the President to invoke that with respect to our closest ally and neighbor, and in the trenches with our soldiers in every war we've been in. So, Mr. President, I just urge President Trump to do the right thing here. He can be tough. He can pursue his policies. But the first principle that every one of us in public office should respect is that we do no harm to the people we represent by the policies we advocate. Mr. President, I yield back. Mr. President.
Recognize the senator from Vermont.
Thank you, Mr. President. Over the past 2 weeks, political operatives in the administration of President Trump and Elon Musk have shown the American people and the world that they plan to destroy as much of the professional workforce in the executive agencies as they can get away with. Whether it's illegal, and it is, or unconstitutional, and it is of no concern. Inspector generals and career civil servants who have served the American people for decades, some for their entire professional lives, are being summarily removed without any due process at all, and due process they're legally entitled to. They're being replaced with Musk-approved partisans who have little, if any, government experience or little, if any, substantive knowledge. They do have a qualification, and that's total loyalty to the president. On top of Mr. Musk's list of agencies to eliminate in the U.S. is the U.S. Agency for International Development, or USAID as we know it. That has been the subject of a ferocious attack by Mr. Musk. That agency is one that not many Americans know about, but which fulfills a vital mission. It has a relatively small budget, less than 1% of the total federal budget, and it has a large responsibility to support humanitarian, economic development, and governance programs in more than 100 countries. Whatever, quote, savings Elon Musk might obtain from cutting USAID would have no appreciable impact in offsetting Mr. Trump's huge tax cuts for the wealthiest Americans. It wouldn't even amount to a rounding error. But last week, in the manner in which this is done, I find extremely disturbing. Mr. Musk, and by the way, for all his brilliance, he has no government experience himself. He called USAID a criminal organization. Dozens of USAID's dedicated senior officials, including the Office of General Counsel, were purged. That's not happened before. That has not happened before in this country. And over the weekend, Musk called USAID evil and a viper's nest of radical left Marxists who hate America. Others in the administration have accused USAID personnel of insubordination and acting against American interests without producing any evidence to back that up. Reminiscent of the McCarthy era, make the accusation, destroy the reputation, and move on. That's a serious question, and we should, each of us, be asking the implications of this language. I find Mr. Musk's accusations appalling. I know they're factually baseless, and frankly, I find them despicable. It's also curious because in 2022, his company Starlink received millions of dollars from USAID for Starlink's operation in Ukraine, not to mention the incredible amount of taxpayer subsidies that helped Tesla become the major company that it is. And Mr. Musk, he is a billionaire, as we know. He has no reluctance to take taxpayer funds from USAID. None. He took money from USAID. It was a good organization when the money was coming from it to him to help us in Ukraine. But now he's calling it a criminal organization. And I doubt that he knows what 99% of USAID employees do, or the positive impact they have on the lives of people around the world, and on U.S. national security, the obligation all of us have as members of the United States Senate. I wonder if he's ever met or has ever spoken to anyone who works at any of the 60 overseas missions, or seen with his own eyes what USAID does in countries like Indonesia, Ethiopia, Haiti, Mozambique, Ghana, or Guatemala, just to name a few, where the lives of countless people really do benefit from USAID. And being billionaires, President Trump and Elon Musk may not be aware that fully 1 billion people in the world live on less than $1 a day. They may not be aware that the lives of hundreds of millions of people, especially children, are threatened by diseases that can be prevented or cured with drugs that cost only a few pennies. Or maybe Mr. Musk is not aware that the life of every American is threatened by the spread of infectious diseases. We saw that with COVID, and there's other diseases out there where what we do elsewhere protects the health and safety of people right here at home. Or maybe Mr. Musk isn't concerned that the Earth's tropical forest and endangered species are being decimated by illegal miners, loggers, and wildlife traffickers, who are often in collusion with local police and transnational criminal organizations to feed, by the way, China's insatiable demand for